All right, so I wanted to add another little video here, and the goal of this video is to give a little bit of background in brief, sort of, as brief as I can go anyway. And so the goal is to give a brief outline of where we are in the world right now. So this is meant to be attached to the analysis that Anthony and I are giving to the book, We Who Wrestle with God, by Jordan Peterson. And I think part of the understanding of this book, or part of what we need to understand when approaching this book, is that it's not just simply a book for all time. It has plenty of wisdom for that, but it's also a book very much of this particular moment. And in that regard, we have to understand that it makes certain claims and it has certain beliefs that it's exemplifying that probably would have only popped up in our present moment. And so within that, there's a kind of prevailing conviction that this book operates alongside of. And to say it in brief, it's that we are, as human beings, guided and structured and constituted by various narratives that provide us with a framework of meaning. So narratives are at the foundation of everything. Peterson says this in Maps of Meaning right out the gate. All right. So Peterson says this on page 9. He says, quote, "Myth can be more accurately regarded as a description of the world as it signifies for action. The mythic universe is a place to act, not a place to perceive. Myth describes things in terms of their unique or shared affective valences, their values, their motivational significances." That's Peterson, page 9 here. If you aren't a fan of Peterson so much, you're looking more for criticism of Peterson, and you're looking for, perhaps you're coming from the left and you prefer somebody on that side and you want to read a source to basically make the same point, well, I give you one of my favorites as well, Slavoj Žižek. In the opening of his book, Living in the End Times, he writes about ideology rather than myth, but to basically the same effect. He says, quote, "Ideology is not constituted by abstract propositions in themselves. Rather, ideology is itself the very texture of the life world, which schematizes the propositions, rendering them livable." This is Living in the End Times, page 3, by Slavoj Žižek. Now, within that, we are essentially constituted by a set of narratives that frame us, that allow us to render certain things livable, to render the world livable, something that we can orient ourselves within. So the destruction of these narratives is a big question, because the simple fact of the matter is we don't all agree on the narratives that we live by. And so an author that I think has more than any other at the present moment contributed to how we navigate this various schematization of the world, or various differing schematizations of the world, is Jonathan Haidt with his book, The Righteous Mind. If you're a fan of Jordan Peterson, you will be definitely familiar with that book. He's interacted with Haidt quite a bit. Haidt has a number of new books. He has a brand new one on the current generation and the impact of social media on them, among other things. And I haven't gotten that far in that book. I just got it. So anyway, he's got a new book out, though. I think it's called The Anxious Generation. It's a good book so far. Probably good overall, I would imagine. He's been fantastic. But in that book, we have a series of discussions for how not only are we oriented and constituted morally and in our general sort of daily orientations in the world, but also how we interact with other moral frameworks. Because the fact of the matter is, one moral framework always frames its opposition as immoral, as something to be opposed. And so there is unquestionably a kind of contestation of wills occurring in this ideological or mythical world in which we live. And so the question then rests very heavily, what are the orienting myths? And there are more than just two conflicts occurring, and he gives us plenty to deal with here. He gives us a great framework for assessing them and assessing the hierarchy of values within them. But within that, while it is insanely reductive to do so, there are still only a handful of narratives that sort of shape us today. And in fact, there's one, if we're going to understand Peterson, that I think stands out above the rest. And that narrative is what we might call, where did I put the books? I just set them out for this so that I have them within reach, and now I can't find them. Right under my pad. Sorry about that. The books I would recommend most for orienting us in this regard are these two, Liquid Modernity by Zygmunt Bauman and The Return of the Strong Gods by R.R. Reno. I'm not aware of anyone putting these side by side. Reno's came out in 2019. I think this one came out in like 2015. I want to say, no, he died around 2015. It might have been come out around 2000, actually, I think. Yeah, 2000. I was way off. So those two books, though, are dealing with the current stage of the world. Now, if you're coming from a Marxist orientation, you're going to see what Bauman calls the liquidity of the world as being due to a kind of capitalist dissolving of everything. So Marx and Engels have in the Communist Manifesto the line about how everything will melt into air. All that is solid melts into air. And this is a consequence for the Marxist of the dissolving power of capital to dissolve and remake at its own will everything. And so this happens, though, as Bauman points out, ultimately we go through periods where there's this purpose of dissolving all of these things, precisely so that we can rebuild them. What Bauman actually is even talking about is that certain things, we came to a certain kind of dissatisfaction with the world, with the way the world was constituted. And the idea was that the sort of framing ideas just simply don't work. Something about them has fallen, and so we've dissolved them precisely to see what's worth preserving, so that then we can build back up into some new, better, more solid world. In other words, the solidity or of the former world wasn't worth preserving, so now we're moving to the solidity of a new world, but in between you have to dissolve everything. Now that's very important because for Peterson, of course, that we are living in a time wherein these framing narratives have been dissolved by what he calls postmodern neo-Marxism. And this idea of the dissolving forces of society, Peterson will localize not so much in just capitalism itself, but rather in the Marxists and the anti-capitalists, those people who came to the capitalist narrative and said, that doesn't work, and started tearing it down. Now, Peterson's not naive. He doesn't think that there's nothing to criticize about capitalism, but at the same time, he's also not a raving, frothing at the mouth Marxist who's just like nothing is good about it either. He's kind of this nice middle of the road guy who says, yeah, look, I love capitalism, but the fact of the matter is, we do need to fix some things. It's not like nothing needs fixing, right? It's an imperfect system like all the rest. And so within that, though, there's unfortunately a kind of triangulation. We have all been sort of corralled into a set of only a couple of ideas that govern everything, that prevent us from asking certain questions, reaching certain conclusions, and all of that framework essentially comes from what R.R. Reno calls the dominance, or the domineering, rather, of the post-war consensus. If you want another conservative source, by the way, to talk about this, the opening of this book by Yoram Hazony, Conservatism, it has a great section that largely just almost maps one-to-one with what Reno's saying in Return of the Strong Gods. Now, the basic point with Reno, he's got a whole lot of great insights in that book, but essentially the World War II happened and it wrecked the world's consciousness. Now, all optimism basically just dissolved in a sea of pessimism, because how in the world could the most advanced society ever collapse this badly? How could we not just collapse into all-out warfare, which just prior to World War I, we were thinking, war is an obsolete thing. We're enlightened. We've moved beyond this. And then World War I happens, and then World War II happens, right? The question is, we were so optimistic. How did we then, at this point in our development, collapse so badly into everything that happened in the 20th century? And so it's in essence a kind of trauma that the world has experienced, and we are still reeling from the trauma. We are finding new ways to measure ourselves in accordance with this trauma. And so various different theories have occurred, have emerged about how to prevent precisely the things that caused the trauma. However, these theories, these beliefs that are trying to prevent the trauma have turned into their own kind of totalitarianisms. At least ideologically speaking, they've turned into their own kinds of totalitarianisms. And so you end up with somebody like, for example, I don't think he mentions them, but you have Umberto Eco, who has this article, this sort of famous article on Fascism, or You Are Fascism, Eternal Fascism. And if you read that article, it's got a lot of great insights. It's a really fun one. But so much of what he says applies to literally every single ideology in existence ever, that it's kind of, you're left with a little bit of a head-scratching moment of well, that would make everybody a fascist. That doesn't really work as a definition. But that kind of actually maps onto what we're experiencing today. The great fear is fascism. If you're called a fascist, if you're called a totalitarian, an authoritarian, that is the thing to avoid. That is the thing that we fear. That is what we want to prevent from ever happening, because we naively believe that it's only the fascist and that it's only those group of people, that if we just localize them in this category of fascist and never do that again, that all of these problems of the world will just disappear. At least we won't bring ourselves to World War II and repeat the same evils. And the fact is, that's a pretty naive belief, because also the fact is fascism was one of a bunch of different ideologies competing at that time. If you read Alexander Dugin is a kind of famous thinker, or rather infamous thinker, at least in the West right now, who says that there were really three ideologies that were gripping us during the 20th century, and those were fascism, liberalism, and communism. And so basically we can read the 20th century as just the duking out of those ideologies, wherein ultimately the last man standing is capitalism, which allowed liberalism, which allowed liberalism to just sort of say that everything now must be measured by this liberal ideology. It's good insofar as it promotes liberalism. It's bad insofar as it is against liberalism. If it goes beyond liberalism, then it is communism. If it regresses from liberalism, then it's fascism. Things like that, right? Like everything is measured in accordance with liberalism. You go back to Reno, and the point is, what this terminates in, practically speaking, is, first off, an eternally open society. We cannot close our society off to anyone, because that's what the fascists did. The fascists came along and they said, these are the good good civilians, these people are to be excluded. So we have this inclusion-exclusion map, essentially binary, that gets forced onto literally everything. And so if you are inclusive, you are good. If you are tolerant, you are good. If you are exclusive, you are bad. If you are intolerant, you are bad. And so everything gets measured in accordance with this. Now, obviously, that kind of simple binary is rather dumb on its face, because you tend to find this played out in society, that those people screaming loudest that we need to be tolerant are incredibly intolerant of anybody that doesn't agree with them that we need to be tolerant. There's this kind of meta question that keeps popping up. Well, the post-war consensus essentially just ignores that and just says, be open, be open, be open. Like, it just insists on that over and over again. It's like this just blaring axiom of the present age. Be open, do not exclude. Exclusion is bad. Exclusion is fascism. And so then we move into our next one, which is to say, well, exclusion always occurs on the basis of strong ideals. So, we'll say that these people are morally good, therefore these people are morally bad. And to take a statement that these people are morally good requires that we have some ethical framework, some strongly defined ethical framework that says this is good, right? And so the moment you make that statement, this is good, it's a determination. And determinations divide the positive from the negative, the yes from the no, the this from the that, right? And so determinations themselves become, in essence, the problematized means by which fascism endures in the present. Because anytime you draw a determination, you say this, not that. You say this is good, that is not. The moment you do that, you've now gone against the axiom of it being an open society. And if it's no longer an open society, then you are a fascist and you are bad, and therefore you need to be done away with. And so now all of a sudden, we can't even stand for ideals. We kind of have to ironically stand for ideals now because, for example, toleration is good and intoleration is bad. And so obviously some determinations have endured, and we just prefer to not bring that up and talk about that rather than trying to figure out how do these cohere together. And so the post-war consensus maintains this axiom that's indefensible in the long run on precisely these grounds that, nope, just don't be a closed society. And so the closed society, interestingly enough, though, means that we now have to be opposed, because the Open Society and Its Enemies is a book written by Karl Popper, and he opposes basically everything in the history of philosophy prior to the positivistic philosophies of the 20th century. So Plato becomes incredibly problematized. Plato becomes a fascist. In fact, he becomes an essential precursor of fascism. It's not long before people like Hegel become fascists, before people like Nietzsche become fascists. It doesn't matter if they lived a century beforehand or millennia beforehand, they become fascists. And so all of a sudden, the history of thought becomes an incredibly problematized and problematizing thing. And so we have to sort of distance ourselves from the history of thought. But now, how are we supposed to orient ourselves if all of these narratives have succumbed? Well, then Reno talks about we have to have therapies. We have to have these guiding therapies that help us to deal with the fact that we are now in a meaningless world. And if we try to reconstruct any kind of meaning, we're immediately fascists. Right? So we have to have these therapies of disenchantment that he talks about. And so when we move into these therapies of disenchantment, well, we start moving into the next book on the list, which is, again, to sort of recount the structure of this brief lecture. We believe that we are narratively constituted beings. Narratives are problematized, so we need these therapies to help us come up with meaning in the world and develop ourselves. And so now the question is, where's man? Where is mankind? Where is humanity in this? Right? And that gets us to a book that has, in evangelical circles anyway, become quite popular. I don't know if it's popular outside of those, but it's a really good book. It's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Now, I recommend that book as opposed to a few others that are worth mentioning, precisely because that's kind of a good introduction to like this whole discourse that is formed. If you want to jump headlong into the deep end on this discussion, then I would recommend turning to, first of all, Charles Taylor. He has a book called The Sources of the Self, and he has another book called The Secular Age, or A Secular Age. And those books are door stoppers. I mean, they're massive books, but they're worth every page. They're worth every second you spend reading them. And Taylor is drawing from those. He's also drawing heavily from the works of Alistair MacIntyre, particularly the book After Virtue that I would recommend. But then there's also one, I think it's called Three Rival Modes of Moral Inquiry, I want to say, that the book is titled. And that's also very well worth watching or worth reading. And these books are essentially getting at what we will call the atomization of the individual. And if you're not familiar with the discourse, you might have heard me say atom as in the name. I mean atom as in like, the molecular kind of thing, right? Like these atoms, right? We're made of nothing but atoms and materiality, right? So, the atomized individual is the individual stripped of all these formerly constituting elements to us, right? We're no longer spiritual beings. We're no longer national beings. We're no longer connected in some sort of deeper human essence because that would be too spiritual, quite literally. We are, it's in a sense, this purely stripped material sense of man. Now, if you're coming more from the left, think, for example, of Marx's idea, Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, or even at the end, the latter part of Marx's Capital, where he's talking about man being essentially reduced to a machine, right? The point of man being reduced to a machine, as we find in the first chapter of the Communist Manifesto and in some of the latter chapters, I think it's the latter third of Capital Volume 1, is that what man becomes is an impersonal force that becomes a cog in a machine, essentially. The machine does the work. Man just becomes this sort of ghost in the shell, if you will, this animating spirit that is being used for the purposes of production. And so what we are on an essential level, like the dignity of man is one of the elements, but really also just in general, the rationality of man, the uniqueness of man, all these different elements have been stripped from us. It doesn't matter if I'm an American working in this machine, or if I'm a Mexican working in this machine, or if I'm a Canadian working in this machine, or if I'm anybody on this coast, or if I'm a European or China or anywhere in Asia, right? Like it doesn't matter, right? Even the Australians don't matter in this regard, right? Like the fact of the matter is what we're looking at is a human being stripped of every constituting element reduced to just a force, a self-determining force in the machine. Now, the way this idea is sold to us, of course, is that it's sold to us in the sense of we get to make ourselves. We are not determined to be anything. We're open ourselves. It's not just that the society is infinitely open. We are infinitely open, and then we just choose what we want to be. And so the world becomes a world of choices. And we define ourselves not so much by what we are, but by what we choose. And so the essence of man is to become a choosing thing. What do we choose from? Our pure freedom. What is our pure freedom? The choosing apparatus. That's about it, right? Don't ask that question, really is the answer. Because freedom is always defined as the freedom to choose. And so, well, okay, all right, cool. Seems somewhat circular, so don't push further. That's the problem. And so that's an atomized individual. If you appeal to somebody like Carl Trueman, he's more on the right. And so this idea of the atomization of the individual is to say that all of those constituting elements have been stripped from us, and now we are reconstituting ourselves in this therapeutic sense of more or less designed to stave off identity. And not only is it staving off identity, but if we are at all to continue to reconcile ourselves with identity, well, this leads us to our next book, The Critique of Critical Reason Cynical Reason. Sorry, The Critique of Cynical Reason by Peter Sloterdijk. I can't believe I was forgetting the title. But that's a fantastic book. And it has one of the most famous lines in the discourse from it, wherein essentially he defines, I'll just read it, it's worth reading. Page 5, actually, it's right out the gate. He says that cynicism is enlightened false consciousness. And that definition is huge. Essentially what it means is that the Enlightenment sought to teach us to be wary of all those determining forces that were shaping us and what we are. One of the great moments of Zygmunt Bauman's book, it's not actually in this book, but it's one of his things overall, is that he holds that postmodernism is just the animating spirit of modernism just laid bare. The mask came off and we just saw what it really was. And what that means is that modernism always was this thing designed to strip us of these constituting elements and allow us to be reduced to this just pure freedom that we are. And that pure freedom, of course, is profoundly vague, ambiguous, and it increasingly starts to just look like a choosing apparatus. But the fact of the matter is, this movement, in essence, of modernism comes to the fore in postmodernism, which is to say that I have no constituting elements because I have become enlightened to the fact that others are trying to shape me. Others are trying to make me be in a certain way. Now, if others are trying to make me be in a certain way, then I can't be free and so long as I capitulate to that. But here's the problem. If I'm a choosing apparatus, then anytime I choose, am I not capitulating? Isn't that exactly what I'm doing? And so the problem is, what Sloterdijk points out with the cynical approach to reason, is that we are enlightened to all these different modes of false consciousness, all these different modes and ways by which we are manipulated. But now that we are choosing apparatuses, we just willingly choose certain things, but we only choose them ironically. We don't truly invest ourselves in them. We choose them ironically, which is to say, look, I know I'm being duped. So what? Right? Like, I chose it, so I'm not actually being duped. I'm not actually a sucker. I'm just choosing this because I got to choose something, and I like this. Obviously, I think if you hear that definition, you're probably going to say, yeah, that's a really unsatisfying state to be in. And he's right. It is a really unsatisfying state to be in. Sloterdijk's critiquing it for like 600 pages there. Anyway, so with Carl Trueman, though, with this rise and triumph of the modern self, he connects it more specifically to the transgender movement in terms of his apologetic approach, but the idea of man itself as sort of this atomized individual is really what he gives a great account of throughout the book. And actually, to go back to Alexander Dugin, he's made this point for years, that once we are atomized to a point, even humanity itself must be something that must be on the table to be chosen. We can choose to be human or not to be human. So it's not even that we can say man is the choosing apparatus, right? We can say that what we are, freedom, is the choosing apparatus. We don't even choose to be man in some sense, or to be human in some sense. So you see, as Dugin stresses, these sort of post-humanist movements that are emerging all over the world. But then the other thing is, a concurrent movement that's happening at the same time is this movement of what has been called, I don't know if it's actually got a term yet, but it's well outlined in Our Own Image. Now, this book isn't actually overall about this point, but he makes a really interesting point about the myths or the narratives that we tell ourselves in relation to understanding this notion of what is called reason. We are historically defined by Aristotle as the rational animal, the logonikon, right? And this zoe logonikon, this logos principle that unites the life with the thinking thing, basically, that we are, the logos is what defines us, this rational principle. And what is effectively at issue here is that what we understand the logos as, in this rational principle as, in the medieval world, or in the ancient world, is always matched to the kind of predominant technology, the newest type of technology that we have discovered. And so when we discover a kind of, I forget what they're called, the systems that sort of operate because of the energy given into them by the flow of water. I'm forgetting the term. Anyway, so the model of the mind started to look like that. Increasingly, of course, just to jump ahead a whole lot, when we get to the modern age, the present age, we start thinking of ourselves as computers, essentially, right? That when machines were first created, when automata were sort of first produced on the scene, we started thinking of ourselves as automata, and that's in and of itself a kind of obvious connection that you even still see somewhat echoed today. But then once computers came onto the scene and these became the thinking machines, and we started seeing ourselves in their image, right? We started reconceiving of ourselves as computers. well, that becomes a fundamentally shaping element to how we perceive ourselves today. And so you even see an echo of this in the goal of perhaps uploading our consciousness into some sort of digital realm so that we might live beyond our mortal forms. And so we understand, again, consciousness, reason in that sense. Well, that's just a byproduct of the fact that we always understand, throughout all of history, we always understood our means of consciousness, what we are as rational beings, as essentially these technological equivalencies. And so that's what that book is getting at. But within this becomes a particularly important thing because of what Yanis Varoufakis talks about in his book, Technofeudalism, What Killed Capitalism. Now, there are a number of great books on this source. I'm picking him. He's my favorite, but Shoshana Zuboff has a fantastic book called, The Rise of Surveillance Capitalism, I think. I think that's the name of it. And then there's another guy, Durand. Cedric Durand has a book on how techno-feudalism was unleashed by Silicon Valley. Right? There's a number of these books that are great. I think the one that has the most anthropological purchase is Varoufakis's, which is why I'm recommending his. Now, Varoufakis' thesis is far too complex and a bit too much of a digression to get into here, other than to say that I think a couple of points I want to bring out from it are that we have moved, in essence, beyond capitalism is sort of the big headline that you take away from the book. We've moved beyond capitalism. We're no longer a capitalist society. We are a techno-feudalist society. And what this means, in a sense, is that just in the terms of feudalism, the lord owned the land and the serfs worked the land, in essence. Right? The serfs may have owned, to some degree, the means of production, but they didn't own the land on which they produced. So the lord had the right to whatever was produced on that land. And so the lords controlled the economy precisely because they controlled the land, which was the fundamental principle by which the economy worked. They also controlled the space for the markets as well. And so then capitalism comes along and it usurps feudalism. And Varoufakis is in essence saying that this new thing, capitalism basically stresses the people who own the means of production themselves, right? So what is produced belongs to the people that own the means of production. And so the workers end up progressively just being these tools to run the machines that produce the goods, right? And so capital is just further and further accumulated by the people that own the means of production, whereas the people that are producing, the people that are actually running the machines, are further and further alienated from that which they make. I mean, that's kind of the Marxist schema writ large. And he's a Marxist, by the way. And so what Varoufakis is saying, though, is that we are in a new age because ultimately, if you go and buy and sell something, what value is created now online, right? Who you are is mediated by social media. Your economic behavior is mediated by, Amazon, right? When everybody was locked up during COVID, in essence, what did we do? We hopped on Amazon and bought things, right? We couldn't go to Walmart down the road. We couldn't go to the supermarket anywhere. We just hopped on Amazon, bought things, and had them delivered to us by the essential workers. And so then you had in essence, this shift to where the people that own the internet, the various subcategories of the internet, since all the markets operate on the internet. There's a book, I should have actually picked it up and thought about this one, but there's a book called The World is Flat by Thomas Friedman, which essentially is saying that, even like international boundaries are being dissolved for markets. That basically the internet has leveled everything. A person in India can sell me something in the South in the United States of America. And so that just as easily, by the way, as somebody in Michigan or something can sell me something in the United States of America. And so the internet has become this great leveling tool, and because of that, the people, to operate economically within the present world is to operate in the boundaries of the internet. And so the people that own the internet, kind of like the feudal lords before, own the means of production. They don't own the means of production. They have usurped the people who own the means of production. So in the same way that the feudal lords owned the land before, techno-feudal lords own the digital space. But what this means, Varoufakis then says, I think in a very sort of tantalizing passage, is he says that, in essence, what is being rented by us, what they own, is not just the digital space, but our digital identities, insofar as we understand ourselves through this digital lens, right? Like, who am I? Well, where would I go to shape my definition of myself, my understanding of myself? Well, I don't know. I would go to social media. I'm a millennial, so I would say, I guess, Facebook. I don't know what the kids are doing these days, but whatever they're doing, basically that's where they would find their identity. They try to express themselves, TikTok or Instagram or wherever, right? And so our very identities have become encoded in these, to use Tolkien's word, secondary world kind of digital spheres. And so we've become digital beings, in essence, in these digital spheres, and that becomes necessary for our very function. And so we're not even just in a capitalist world where the means of production make all the difference, but rather the people who produce things, the people who own the means of production, are essentially operating in accordance with the laws that govern them, which are stated not by governments, but by the techno-feudal lords. Now, within all of that, that's sort of the economic, the sociological, the individualistic framing of where we are, we need to move into how Christianity is brought into this world, right? It has sort of dropped off here. And to that end, there's a very good passage from this guy, Ryszard Legutko. Ryszard Legutko is very much a member of the Polish right, the Polish Conservative Party, and I don't need to look up the passage actually itself. There's a really great section in here where he talks about how in an open society, in this perfectly liberal society, open society and liberal society oftentimes are used interchangeably in a lot of these different thinkers that I've been referencing. But in an open society, the problem is it requires, if you were to participate, it requires that actually you can't participate in terms of your pure ideal that you had before. So if you're going to operate within the public sphere of an open society, well, a Christian and a Muslim and a communist atheist cannot all operate in the same capacity. You know, a capitalist and a communist in this purely open sphere cannot be pure capitalist and pure communist. So when we see sort of the cultural Marxists sort of operating, the funny thing is they're operating within this sort of open, within the dictates of this sort of open liberal establishment, but to the same capacity. Which is why it's never just a Marxist influence. It's always a kind of Marxist offshoot influence that we encounter when we encounter people on the left today. Same thing goes with anybody in the capitalist world. Same thing goes with anybody within Christianity, right? This overarching governing post-war consensus of liberalism, of the openness of liberalism, is what shapes the world today. And the fact of the matter is, what Ryszard Legutko, I call him the Rizzard, so what the Rizzard actually says here is that you're not going to have just pure Christianity operating in this public sphere. You're going to have Christianity as mediated by the dictates of even entering into this public sphere. Now, to go back to technofeudalism, we can, of course, even see this directly played out in terms of the censorship, that it's starting to be lifted to a certain degree by people like Mark Zuckerberg and so forth, and definitely by Elon Musk when he bought X, or Twitter. But it still doesn't mean there isn't censorship per se, and it still doesn't mean that we are perfectly open. It just means that we're just moving more to a better and broader sense of openness in the society. And so what the Rizzard is pointing to is that if you are going to have any purchase in this new world, you have to adapt your belief system to the mechanisms of this new world, to the dictates of this new world. And by adjusting yourself to this, by adapting yourself to this, you must amend the doctrines. And that brings us to a couple of very important books, right? If we're going to talk about Christianity, you can't talk about pure Christianity, but you have to talk about this neutered form of Christianity that cannot declare itself to be the only way, because that would be exclusionary. If it declares itself to be the only way, that is making a determination, and that is excluding people, and therefore that is not an open Christianity. And so Christianity is one of these things that just gets caught having to play two games at once. It's trying to be the perfect ethical system that's open to everything, because that's the governing ethical belief, but it also has to be this ethical system that says that, by the way, we are the only way. And so you have, the Universalist Christians that start popping up around this time, but you also have a kind of chaotic war within Christianity trying to understand itself. Right? There's no consensus even within Christianity on what it is. And so we come to this point that Carl Trueman, to go back to him, plug in a lot of his books today, Carl Trueman, and literally it's this tiny little pamphlet, right? He writes in The Real Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. I think it's 50 pages. You can read it in a sitting easily. But he says there that the big scandal is that there is no, we call ourselves evangelicals, but the big scandal is we don't have a unifying evangel, right? Like, what in the world are we? There isn't one. And so he recounts this wonderful moment wherein, how does he put it? He's a Protestant, and he's sitting there with an Eastern Orthodox priest and Catholic and another Protestant and a couple other Protestants, rather. And the Protestants are all bickering among each other about doctrinal differences. And finally, one of the Protestants just exclaims, yeah, but I mean, all this doesn't matter. We are all unified in the fact that we all do believe in Jesus, right? And Truman thinks to himself as he sits back, he's like, yeah, I mean, we do, but we just don't believe that he's the same person. Like, we don't think that he did the same thing, right? Like, it's not the same being. And then he looks over to the other people in the room and he's like, wait a second, I actually kind of more agree with the Catholic guy over here. I'm a Protestant Reformed guy, but I agree with the Catholic more than I agree with my fellow Protestants over here. So everything's kind of messed up. And so in that regard, he then writes the real scandal, quote, on page 41. Actually, yes, 41 pages long, because this is the final page. He says, the real scandal of the evangelical mind currently is not that it lacks a mind, but that it lacks any agreed upon evangel. And here's the thing. Of course it would, if it's been translated into this post-war consensus of an eternally open society. Now, you can do one of two things in this situation. You can either say that I will alter historical Christian doctrine openly, amend it, update it to the present norms, and in essence just intentionally break with the past. You see this with a lot of the universalists. You see this with sort of a lot of the inclusive liberal wings of the church. Or you can do what most of the conservative wings of the church have done, and they have still capitulated, but they don't explicitly do that. What they do is they move away from stated doctrine. Think about how doctrine today is oftentimes treated as something that's just divisive, right? We kind of diminish doctrine precisely because it's divisive. Well, what does that sound like? It sounds like the post-war consensus and eternal openness. Shouldn't the church be open? And in doing that, we never will say doctrine doesn't matter because the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus is doctrine. The Trinity is doctrine, right? These are all doctrines. The salvific model is literally doctrine. So you can't get rid of doctrine per se, but you can sideline it. And you can be incredibly vague about it. And more importantly, you can just simply not talk about it. And in not talking about it, it becomes vague precisely because nobody knows what the statements even are about this, right? Anytime you hear somebody talk about the Trinity or giving an example about the Trinity, most likely they're giving you something that was explicitly condemned as heresy by the early church because the Trinity is a very complex doctrine, and today, nobody even talks about it. We'll even talk about, for example, there's a lot of biblical theologians today who kind of will move away from systematic theology because they view that as a kind of corruption, oftentimes. They shouldn't. Not all of them do, but a lot of them do. And the fact of the matter is, when they do this, what they're doing is, in essence, again, still helping themselves distance themselves from these determining doctrines that shape how we understand Christianity. In Protestantism in particular, this has been particularly effective, unfortunately, because this rather asinine interpretation of what sola scriptura means, that has sort of gripped the present age, is that it means that we turn to the Bible for everything and reject any other belief, and in fact that also entails that we reject tradition. We are no longer governed by tradition, and in fact we're incredibly skeptical and wary of tradition, unfortunately. Now, historically speaking, I don't have time to get into it. There is no way, shape, or form that you can defend that view from an historical view of Protestantism. That is not what sola scriptura ever meant. In brief, all that it ever meant was to say that Scripture and tradition are not equally weighted. Tradition is still profoundly weighted for somebody like Calvin and Luther, for example. In fact, it's weighted because oftentimes it forms the lens through which we reach the Scriptures. It's just to say that the lens can never determine the thing that we're looking at through the lens. And so that's more the historical view. But even still, within that, what happens is this sort of biblicist urge creates the conditions whereby we can minimize the discussion of formulated doctrine, right? Which means that we're just not talking about it. And that's the other version. So you can just amend the doctrines, or you can just not really talk about them. And you can certainly never talk about them in depth. And that's another way of dealing with it, which is to say you've capitulated yourself to this post-war consensus precisely by just not making explicit all the places where you differ from the cultural norms and values and ethics of the day. And so this ultimately then creates the opening. If you're not going to unify the church around doctrine, you're going to unify it around something else. A number of people talked about this in the 20th century and into the 21st century. The first person to sort of reference this is a guy by the name of Walter Benjamin in his Theses on History. You also have a really great book by Slavoj Žižek called The Puppet and the Dwarf that you can reference that he talks about this. You have Walter Rauschenbusch in The Social Gospel and Theology for the Social Gospel, and he writes in there that essentially things like total depravity need to be updated. If Christianity is to endure, what do? We have to, in a sense, take this demythologized world and translate Christianity into this mode of politics, would be the simplest way to put it, right? Politics is the function of Christianity now. A demythologized Christianity that is open to, or that is translated into a liberal order, is a political Christianity. In a materialist world, Christianity really, once it's been stripped of its doctrines, really just talks about what we should do. It becomes a moral condition, a moral animus. And so we're debating now, what is the moral condition of Christianity today? Now, within that, there's this really great book called Christianity After Religion by Diana Butler Bass. She is a fantastic scholar on this subject, and I'd recommend actually a lot of her books, but that's just one to get you started. And the idea of religionless Christianity ultimately comes from Dietrich Bonhoeffer with one of his letters while he was in prison, a letter to a friend, wherein he's looking out at the world and he says, I'm not really sure what role is even there for Christianity, and I'm actually terrified of what it will be. And what it ends up being is just, again, political theology becomes political theology, becomes moral theology. And those doctrines are the ones that we split over now. In former ages, we split over the communion, right? Like, what is communion? In former ages, is it an open or closed communion? What is even the nature of the communion? Is the Eucharist actually going to be the real presence of Christ in the bread? Is it going to be just sort of a symbolic reference to Christ? Things like this. Those are ideas that we split over and even burned people at the stake over before. But if anybody's going to be burned at the stake over anything today in Christianity, even figuratively speaking, it's going to be over some sort of moral faux pas, over some sort of political faux pas. We split over that. We don't split over disagreements over the Trinity. And in fact, when you hear people bickering, if you ever do, over like the precise formula of the Trinity, you're probably going to have the knee-jerk reaction of being like, come on, guys, get over it. This doesn't really matter. Let's get to the things that really matter, which are politics, every time. That is demythologized Christianity. That is this post-war consensus Christianity. Is Christianity reduced from doctrine to politics? And so within that, though, there was one more movement that took place in this post-war world, and that is New Atheism. New Atheism showed up, did its thing, essentially just sort of saying that, by the way, religion has become a problem for us, and it's not just become a problem for us, it's actually become very harmful to the way we live. Christianity oftentimes would even be condemned as being intolerant, right? Well, the fact of the matter is they tried to get rid of Christianity and they promised us an enlightened age to come, and as Justin Brierley, I plug it every video I'm in, Justin Brierley says at the beginning of that book, they collapsed. Why? Because they failed to deliver. And then as well, the moral teachings that they were stressing themselves collapsed. So in Justin Brierley's book, The Surprising Rebirth of the Belief in God, Christianity was discovered not to be able to be done away with. And so it comes back in, really, theism more than anything, or some kind of vaguely defined belief in God comes back in as something that we can accept. Now, here's a few more books. I didn't bring them over to show them to the camera anyway, but the point of this thesis is to say that the West civilization needs this religious foundation to build it back up, to actually be able to sustain it. Everybody believes this now, it seems like, even atheists. So Slavoj Žižek is an atheist, and he still believes that. We need some kind that's why his newest book is called Christian Atheism. But also you have guys like Tom Holland, not Spider-Man, but the historian, writing a book called Dominion, making this point. And the thing is, though, Christianity, take appraisal of what this means. Christianity is needed to save the present world. Salvation, though, in this material, historical sense, is always going to be understood through the lens of the governing zeitgeist, through the lens of the governing spirit of the age, the governing moral convictions of the age. And if that is the case, then Christianity as this saving force, will be translated into this new moral verbiage. That's why Christianity is returning, but in the form of a political theology that it never was historically before. All right. It was. I have to admit, it was. There's moments like canon law, for example, the influence of canon law in the medieval period. But again, Christianity was translated there. There's a debate to be had on that point. Point being, though, for historical Christianity, it was not political in the early church. It was not political in the early, the Reformers and a lot of the Puritans and whatnot were not particularly political people. There are certain political theorists, such as Johannes Althusius, that show up. Very great theologian, by the way. But that's all getting into the weeds. I don't want to get into that too much, other than just to say, if you're going to talk about the institutes of the Christian religion, what Calvin writes, which is a book that he's saying this is what Christianity is, all of our wisdom consists of this, the knowledge of God and of ourselves. What he's getting at is Christianity is primarily concerned with these points. And what are they? Soteriology. That's the study of salvation. That's the core of Christianity, not politics, soteriology. So anyway, I know so many debates that can pop out of that simple statement, so I don't want to get sidetracked too much on them. Point being, though, if Christianity is going to be adapted to this present age, it's going to do so through the mediating lens of, unfortunately, some kind of post-war consensus, some kind of moral system that is largely in agreement with the beliefs of the present age. Some sort of individualist idea. If you go back to ancient Rome, for example, or even the medieval period, the idea of justice, if we talked about the term justice, it was localized not in the individual being just, but in the society being just. And if the society was just, it was most likely going to be embodied most perfectly by the magistrate who ruled the society. And so the point being there is that you have a different sense of justice that we're operating through now, but we're pretending now that we're discovering that sense of justice was in Christianity the whole time. But what we're really doing is translating Christianity into this present age. And so the debates that we're seeing pop up around what Christianity is are debates that are following upon that translation. We're really debating how are we going to translate it into the present age. And so you have, for example, the theonomic postmillennialists, presuppositionalists, who are debating that we need to have Christianity be this kind of governing political force that looks like this model. You have Jordan Peterson showing up saying that he's not really getting particularly political with it. He's explicitly said he's trying to move away from it, but he's still saying that the West needs this properly ordered worldview, if you will, that Christianity is giving us to be able to order everything. And so then you have, even with Justin Brierley, with the surprising rebirth of the belief in God, the idea is that we're trying to fill the void of the world left in ruins that the new atheists gave us, which is largely a political world. You look at somebody like, I'm forgetting her name. Her last name is Ali, who was one of the new atheists who converted to Christianity precisely for these political reasons. And so all of this goes to say that if we are to understand Christianity in this present moment, what we are to do is to understand it in the lens of this translation back into society through this mediating form of political theology. It has become a political thing. Its essence now is political, which is why we're debating about it politically. Now, let me also end with this, though. That's not the true essence of Christianity. This is the translated essence of Christianity. Historical Christianity looks nothing like that, I would maintain to my dying breath. But unfortunately, the present age isn't concerned with historical Christianity. The present age is understood with Christianity as some sort of a cure to that which ails us. And that which ails us is not sin, i.e. something that prevents us from reaching the divine, i.e. a transcendent God, but rather sin is some sort of a social woe, right? Like it's some sort of social ill, some social malady that needs to be overcome. And while sin definitely can have, historically speaking, can have social consequences, the point of sin was never, historically, that, even in the medieval period, was never that it's just simply going to ruin society. The point is that it alienates us not from our fellow man, but from God. And so once we are reunited with God, the issues with our fellow man just kind of subside, right? Until we are perfectly reunited with God, though, our issues with our fellow man are not going to get any different. That's the traditional Christian view, which means then that all of these debates about Christianity in the present, simply speaking, have nothing to do with historical Christianity. It's just a further debate on how we translate it into the present. However, if we're going to approach Jordan Peterson's book, the new one, We Who Wrestle with God, we are wrestling with God precisely in order to better and more effectively, in this translated sense of Christianity, engage with the culture. So, and to save it in this world historical material sense. He would say spiritual, but I won't say spiritual because that's not how I understand the word spiritual. So, anyway.